Assalamu alaikum and welcome to today's session where we are meeting with Associate Professor Stéphane Lacroix from Sciences Po Paris, who is also here as visiting professor at our Faculty of Islamic Studies at the International Islamic University of Indonesia. So, Stéphane, welcome to UIII, welcome to Indonesia. It's really a pleasure to have you here. Your work has really focused a lot on the development of society and politics in the Muslim world, but particularly in the Arab Muslim world. So perhaps, as an introduction to our friends who are watching, you can begin by telling us a bit about what got you into the study of Muslim society and Islam and politics in the first place.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks to Farish, Noor, thanks to UIII for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's been a pleasure to be here all this year with you all, having these wonderful conversations, and this is one more of those. Going back to my background, there's a lot of stories I can tell, and I don't know which one is correct, because in a sense we tend to romanticize our trajectories. One fact is that France is closer to the Arab world than many Indonesians imagine. And I've been saying this a lot since I've been here, because a lot of people were like, Europeans, Arab world, we're neighbors. I mean, we've been exchanging ideas and philosophy and a lot of things for. It's not always been a rosy relationship, but it's been a very, very continuous one that has been going on since almost the beginnings of Islam, right? Since the medieval period, and so our language, the French language, has hundreds of Arab words, maybe not as many as Indonesian, but it might actually get close. Those are very different words. In Indonesian, they tend to be words that pertain to specific domains. In French, it tends to be more casual words, but we have a lot of words that come from Arabic, which is a sign of these kind of deep penetration of mutual influences in our history that go a long way back. So, we have, of course, our histories with colonialism. We also have the diaspora phenomenon. We have 10% of people of Arab descent living in France. So I think any Frenchman who grows, especially in the big cities where the diasporas are in bigger numbers, this is something quite familiar to us. I grew up in a suburb of Paris where, as a child, many of my friends were of Algerian, Moroccan, Tunisian, Lebanese descent. So the idea that there was this other part of the world that basically, those were my friends, so they were like me, but I also understood that they were different in some way, for reasons that I, as a child, could not really understand. I would later on understand why. Culture, religion, all these things do not make sense very much for a child. But so, I guess this is really what, in a sense, kind of arose as some kind of curiosity about that other part of the world, that's very close to us, and at the same time different from us, with intertwined histories. And so, I guess that's what, in the wake of my when I started my studying at university, I started to travel as well. That was one of the things that I really liked, and I've continued to do that a lot ever since. And that was a part of the world I was interested in discovering. So I started to travel there. I like languages, so I started to pick up the language, and eventually I said, wow, the part of the world is really interesting. I moved into, started actually doing something completely different. I studied mathematics first, but then I got into actually humanities, that kind of corrected my trajectory into humanities, and getting closer to social science. And I said, well, that's the occasion to try to understand this very familiar otherness, right? Because there's this familiarity and otherness at the same time that I was really interested in trying to unpack. And then, I guess the question of religion came in, because for a range of reasons that some of them are coincidences, and of course, we sometimes tend to a posteriori rationalize everything we do, but there's a lot of coincidences. I did my master's on Yemen, because my university had a partnership with a French center that was based in Sana'a in Yemen. And so I stayed in Yemen for a few months. I wrote my MA thesis on Yemen. And of course, this is a society where religion is very, very central, right? It's a very traditional society that is, the role of religion is very predominant. So when you start to think about society in a place like Yemen, you cannot escape reflecting about religion. And then for my PhD, I was lucky enough to be able to work on Saudi Arabia. I say lucky enough because there was the moment when Saudi Arabia was starting to open up to the idea of foreign research. And again, when you come to Saudi Arabia, you see how important religion is in shaping society and politics and so many things. So, I mean, I guess, yeah, I got attracted to that. Maybe also, again, there's many stories we can tell to ourselves. As, you know, coming from a secular country, I think I've always been interested in trying to understand what is different from me, right? So I come from a secular society, and now I'm working on countries where religion is very foundational, right? And so you know, that again, understanding that otherness was kind of what drove me to that study. So yeah.
Well, in essence, to pick up what you said earlier, right? This is something we tend to forget, that as far as Europe is concerned, by virtue of its geography, its closest and its longest, oldest civilizational neighbor is actually Islam. Yes, because Europe is literally surrounded by Muslim countries. But I'm fascinated by your work for a number of reasons. As you've said yourself, you take Islam seriously, yeah, and it is a factor that looms very large in your own research. Because you're studying the behavior and society and politics of Muslim societies, but you don't bracket Islam out of that. Now, I want to push you a bit further on this, because when you look at Islamic studies, it's actually interesting to see that Islam has been studied particularly in the West. I mean, other parts of the world may have some interest in Islam, but we don't really see an equivalent in say East Asia or in South America. Well, perhaps because of the geographical distance or what have you, but Europe is entangled with Islam by virtue of its history and its geography. Why I've noticed, yeah, when you look at how Islam has been studied, how Muslims have been studied by many European scholars, there's a tendency, especially from the 20th century, to focus on things like the sociology of Muslim societies, or the anthropology of Muslim societies, or the politics or the economy of Muslim societies. What, for me, is different in your work is that you seem to regard Islam as an important factor to understanding how Muslim societies work. Can you elaborate a bit on that? Why have you taken this approach?
Yeah, I mean, it started with a kind of a dissatisfaction with you know, what has for a long time been the dominant approach in social science and sociology, anthropology of Muslim societies. That is, this very, I mean, probably has to do with the dominant academic trend since the 60s in Europe, which saw religion as some kind of superstructure that you know, didn't really matter per se. Some would say it was just a language, and what you needed to do is decipher the deep dynamics that were going on, the infrastructure, the political, the economic, the social dynamics. And so, yeah, religion was just a language in which those dynamics were expressed. And I felt that, I mean, first, I mean, by spending time in Muslim countries and speaking to people, I always felt that religion was more than that to them. But also, I feel that you know, it is. I mean, it's been very, how could I say? It's been easy also to think that way, because of course, you know, when you study Muslim societies, Muslim movements, Islamic movements, they speak the language of Islam. You can just pretend they're not really saying what they're saying. and you can just look for the subtext. But if you take seriously what they're saying, if you consider that it matters to them per se, then you have to open yourself up to a completely new other field, which is getting to know enough in Islamic fiqh, in Islamic theology, to try to understand what kind of ideas they're trying to connect themselves to, what kind of foundational stories and histories, what kind of concepts that all have a history. So, the discursive tradition, as Talal Asad would say, you have to take seriously the discursive tradition. And of course, Talal Asad is one of those who coined that term, and he was in his own work trying to do that. But again, I feel that trying to mix those two approaches is very valuable. That is, not to think that everything is social, economic, or political, but also not to think, by the way, because that's been the other problematic approach, that everything is religious, that that there's no politics, no economy, no society involved. So my work has been I've tried different approaches. I've been influenced by Bourdieu, and I've been getting more acquainted to what we call pragmatic sociology. Which were different ways to try to approach social movement theory, which also tried to do the same thing. There's different ways to try to, reconcile those two things. How can we take the fact that those are movements who really believe in what they say about religion, and at the same time they're not just driven by religion. There are other causes that explain why they appear, why they succeed, why they fail. So yeah, that's really been what I've been trying to do. I think it's not only me. I think there's a generation of us who's trying to. This kind of dialectical movement of science, we're trying to overcome some of these dichotomies of the past. But yeah, this has been something that has been very important to me in my own work.
I take your point about how a lot of this was the result of the massive changes that the scientists in the 60s. It was a French man, 68, of course.
Yeah.
So anthropology goes through enormous changes, and sociology is critiqued for its historical connotations and linkages to colonialism, have you. So we have that. And I think what happens from the late 60s onwards is, in a sense, a desacralization of the world. Everything is reduced now to political economy and human agency. But then if you go down that path too much, then all the rest, ethnicity, culture, history, religion, all of that becomes just background.
Yeah.
It's part of the decoration of the house itself. What I like about your approach, and I think many would agree with me, is, like you said, you're trying to find this balance. And of course, later on, I want to push this in our discussion, because now, in some instances, we see, again, a movement to the other extreme. Everything is because of religion.
Yeah.
And this is, unfortunately, one of the results of what's happened to Islamic studies post 9/11. Everything is blamed on that religion. But let's talk about that later. For now, what do you think is the direction that religious studies in general and Islamic studies in particular ought to take? If you look at history, for example, nobody writes history like we did in the 50s. There is deconstructive history. We accept non-linear history. We accept multiple complex histories. Now, Islamic studies, of course, is not a discipline itself. It encompasses all these other disciplines. But give us, your impression of where we are now as far as religious studies and Islamic studies is concerned, and where would you like to see it going?
If I'm going to take an example in Islamic studies, I think there's been a lot of progress done over the last 10 years, which is really interesting in the sense that for a very long time, let's say contemporary Islamic studies. That's what I do. 19th, 20th century. I'm not in a capacity to speak about more the previous periods. But for 19th and 20th century, a lot of studies took for granted this kind of foundational myth of the Nahda. And I think this is one of the very interesting things that's been going on, and that opens, and we'll maybe come back to that later also in the talk, many, many doors. What I mean by the foundational myth of the Nahda is that the idea that until the 19th century, there was this period of jumud. This was this period of, I think in Indonesian you'd say kejumudan, right? This moment of stagnation, right? So there's the golden age. There's the golden age, Abbasid, philosophy, Bayt al-Hikmah and everything. Then, there's this moment when philosophy dies in Islam. It's mostly actually, people who say this would say Sunni Islam, but then they would not provide many very strong arguments for that. Usually they would say tahafut al-falasifa, and then it's finished, no more creativeness, taqleed, the reproduction of previous legal opinions, no more philosophy. Then there's this Ottoman period, which is seen as, kind of a delusion of strength, but that just predates the final collapse, right? And that collapse can be traced back centuries before to that period of stagnation. And then in the 19th century, finally, Europe comes, right? The savior, Europe comes, and Europe does invade, but Europe also brings with it a lot of new ideas, and that the appropriation of these new ideas,
and the rejection,
the discussion with these new ideas, or the critical appropriation of some of them, the rejection of others. All the debates that are triggered by this influx of new ideas leads to the Nahda, right? And it's interesting that many of the scholars of the Nahda themselves use that exact same narrative. So if you people like Muhammad Abdu in Egypt, they actually use that narrative because it suited them. They wanted change, and they thought that by portraying those who were before them as stagnant, ignorant, stuck in taqleed, they would have a stronger argument to push forward their own idea. It's very interesting because it's exactly what happened in the Renaissance in Europe, right? So we're having exactly the same process now in Islamic studies. That is, basically for a long time we took for granted what the Renaissance thinkers told us. Until the 15th century, it was the Dark Ages, the medieval period. Those people were ignorant, irrational. Suddenly, Renaissance comes, new thinkers, we rediscover the past, we rediscovered the Salaf as-Salih from the Roman Empire, right? Because everyone has their Salaf as-Salih, right? So we read Cicero, we read all of that, and suddenly, the Renaissance comes, And to push for the Renaissance, you have to portray the medieval period as a dark age. Well, it was exactly what people like Muhammad Abdu did. They did exactly what the thinkers of the European Renaissance did. They portrayed what was before them as a dark age, and that's been taken for granted. That is, people like the Orientalists of the time, Louis Massignon and others, who were reading, they started taking on that narrative. The narrative suited everyone, because in a sense it suited people like Muhammad Abdu because it gave a justification for their impulse to change. It suited the Europeans because it made them the hero of the story, right? So it suited everyone, right? And so what we've been seeing over the last 20 or 30 years is a reconsideration, is a very deep critique of that history, with people who've been again, it's not really my work, but I think it changes everything in the way we look at the long history, the longue durée history of Islam. People like Khaled al-Royhab's book on Islamic thought in the 17th century, and he said it's not Jumud, it's actually very interesting. There's a lot of things happening. Of course, there was Halak's article, there was never a closure of the doors of Ijtihad. There is Frank Griffel's recent book on philosophy after Al-Ghazali. He says, there was a lot of philosophy actually going on. So there was much more continuity. There was much more liveliness in the tradition. And so the rupture that some people think happened in the 19th century didn't really happen. So we need to reconsider not just the 19th century, but also a lot of the ways in which we looked at the 20th century. And so I think this is some of the most interesting ideas that have been put out and that have inspired me in my own work, although my work is more the 20th century. But I also start from that same premise.
Okay.